This is going to be a long day. Bob Anderson has just asked me who's on first, and I said, you are, and he said, no, he's on second. It's a joke, evidently, that went back into the early 1900s, or Bob wouldn't know it.
When Bob was about that big.
What happened to Lou Costello?
He's still that big.
Everybody's heard of that.
My name's Oaks. I'd like to thank you for coming, in many cases for coming back. Your time, your money are appreciated. The speakers today will range from Reverend Ed Opitz to Howard Beecher, anywhere from 30 to 70. They cover a myriad of experiences in the free market. They cover the philosophy that we, by and large, maintain and hold. There are, no thanks to me, no books outside, but there will be later. There are some handouts. Bob was kind enough to bring down some notes from Fee. John Sparks is the new president, and Mr. Sparks has written several very good articles. I recommend one he wrote back in the late 50s, early 60s, Zoned or Owned. The one out front, If Men Were Free to Try, is excellent. Please pick them up. We're going to divide this thing up into morning and afternoon segments as usual. Bob and Ed will speak this morning, and then we'll divide, hopefully, into a group discussion rather than having to take questions from the audience. If you have questions, please write them down. If you have opinions, please express them in the discussions. I'm going to turn it over to Dick and let Dick do what's left of the formal introductions and get things underway. There is coffee in the back. They didn't put out any Coca-Colas. They'll be out midway, so y'all don't give up on it. But thanks for coming, and we hope it all goes well this time. As it did last time you were here.
Thank you, Corey. I'm reminded when we kick off these activities of what Franklin said, that a nation of well-informed men who have been taught to know and prize the rights which God has given them cannot be enslaved. It is in the region of ignorance that tyranny begins. That's what this kind of activity is all about, removing ignorance, and of which there is a great deal. Concerning free market principles. And Bob Anderson and the group from Fee, Ed Opitz and Howard Beecher and the rest of these folks, fine folks who've come down here today to be with us, are going to endeavor to sweep away some of the collectivist, socialist, anti-free market attitudes which we all harbor, despite our best intentions and efforts. And don't let the size of this group concern you. The remnant has always been small. It will always remain small. The Lord doesn't work through large numbers. He never has, he never will. So those of us who are here today will go forward throughout our activities in the future and hopefully touch enough others to make the difference that we need to make. I'm not going to say a lot more except that Bob Anderson, I've known Bob for over a year personally. I've been a reader of his materials in the Freeman, the Fee monthly publication, for some time, and been most appreciative of his endeavors in that area. So Bob is going to speak to us this morning on the development of the market economy. So would you please with me welcome warmly, in customary Georgia fashion, Mr. Robert Anderson.
And Senholtz sometimes says after an introduction like that, I'll be anxious to hear what I have to say. And then his wife corrected him one time and said, you should never say that. That will cause your audience to have all sorts of misgivings about your knowledge of your subject. I'll be anxious to hear what I have to say. It's good to be back. I know that most of you are sitting out there with the programs that we mailed out to you from Irvington. The new program will be here shortly. We have to understand and be somewhat compassionate regarding Corey Oaks. He's over 40 and a little absent-minded. and as a result, he couldn't find the keys to his establishment this morning and could not, therefore, have the programs here at the start. So let me just take a minute to give you an overview of where we're headed today. We have 4 speakers instead of 3, as originally indicated. The sessions will be running for 1 hour, the lecture sessions. If I'm not through by 10 o'clock, shoot me. But we'll take a break after my lecture, and then Ed Opitz will be speaking for an hour. Following that, we are going to then have discussion sessions where you folks can direct it for an hour, lunch, and then a return and repeat performance this afternoon, following the same format as this morning, with a lecture by Clarence Carson, followed by Howard Bacher, and then we will have another wrap-up discussion session of 1 hour. So that's the program that we're going to be following today. We felt that in the case of many of you that are well acquainted already with this philosophy, that it would be more appropriate perhaps to let you direct the subject matter rather than for us to do it in the form of formal lectures. And so as a consequence, the 2 sessions today where what we discuss will be determined basically by the questions or comments that you folks have to make. Now, let me begin this morning by making a point that I think is self-evident, one that we all are keenly aware of, and that is that we can't know everything, and we never will be able to know everything. But we do know some things. The fact that we can't know everything doesn't mean that we can't know something. And herein is where the problem begins.
Anderson doesn't know anything.
That's right. That's the problem. The problem is that some things that we know may be true or they may be false. And it's sorting them out. That's the difficult task for the human race. Now, we today are living in an age of collectivism. There's nothing new or nothing unique about this. If we go back and look at the history of civilization from the very beginning of time, we see that the history of mankind has been basically where some people plundered other people, where some people had dominion over others. I see Harry Smith is in the audience, and he has an article in the current issue of the Freeman magazine, which we brought with us, on the role of women in economic history. An article which, if I have anything to say about, it's going to be in Reader's Digest. An outstanding treatment of the role of women in economic history. And of course, in it, Harry uses the expression political man to refer to us guys that engaged over the millennium in plundering. The only point I want to make here at the beginning is this, that there's nothing new about what's going on in the world today. It's as ancient as the human race. This idea of some people living off the productive backs of other people through some sort of political mechanism or process. Now, this is the age in which we live. Frédéric Bastiat, my favorite 19th century author, a French assemblyman, an essayist, certainly one of the most liberal free marketeers of the 19th century, wrote a booklet called The Law. Many of you, I know, are acquainted with it. And in it, he called this process legal plunder. This idea of some people trying to live off the backs of others, where through the political process, we take the property of some individuals in order to enhance the well-being of others. It's always been so. It's an idea that is very ancient. There are some things that we know that are false, and there are some things that we know that are true, and of course the name of the game is sorting them out, being able to determine what's right and what's wrong. And Bastiat and many others before him, and many today, clearly see the immorality, the unethical nature of a social order in which some people are plundering other people. Bastiat put it so well, though. He said, it's that great fiction where everybody believes that they can live off of everybody else. And it's that falsehood, it's that fallacy. It's, as Harry Smith tells us, that's that political man mentality that we must eradicate from our being if the ideal free market, private property order is to evolve. Now, the topic of my lecture this morning was the development of the market economy. And basically, that's where I'm going to go, to take a look at what is needed in order to bring about the development of a market economy. But what is needed to bring about the development of a market economy is certain presuppositions in terms of ethical absolutes that are vital to the formulation of the modern market process in which we live today. Now, when we look around at the world in which we live today, there's an important point that should be made. It was not always like this. The economic well-being that we enjoy in this society today is very unique. It is not something that has always been a part of human history. I just had the misfortune this past week of watching on HBO parts of Gandhi, probably the most distorted movie ever made in the history of movie making. But nevertheless, certain truths did slip through, one of which was the unbelievable abject poverty of the Indian culture. India is one of the poorest countries in the world, and still is one of the poorest countries in the world today. The economic level of living in that society is so low that if any of us were thrust into it, I have no doubt but what we would perish within very short order. We simply could not survive in the misery and squalor that is today's India. And so it's important to understand that where we are is unique in human history. That throughout the millennium, throughout the period in which man has walked on this earth, the typical lifestyle was one of abject poverty. A return to nature is a return to misery beyond belief. Throughout all of history, most people died very, very young, did not survive even through the first few months of life. The infant mortality rate until the modern era was always in excess of 50%. Even in modern England, as late as the middle of the 18th century, the infant mortality rate was, by historical estimate, indicated around 70%. Unbelievably high. The vast majority of the people lived in hovels and squalor. A return to nature is a return to unbelievable poverty. A study of human history is a study of human misery. Only in the modern era, and only in certain parts of the world, have we seen an unbelievable transformation in the lifestyle of the people, the masses, that are living in the societies of today. We look at today's American economy, and we see a lifestyle that would have been inconceivable, even to our own forefathers in this country 100 years earlier. Absolutely inconceivable that the things which we today take for granted would ever be realized. And yet they are. I always like to point out a few of them, one of which, of course, is particularly personal with me. I'm as blind as a bat, but I wear contact lenses. Last week I took my daughter over to have her fitted for contacts. I wear the old gas-permeable hard lenses. And I took her in, and they have these soft lenses now. And they plop them on her eye, and she just walks out of the store wearing them. I mean, the magic of that, for a person who suffers from regressive nearsightedness, to be able to walk in off the street and have a piece of film put on the eye and walk out with perfect vision. And she's about as bad as me. She'd walk into the wall, too, without corrective lenses. We take it for granted. And yet, up until the modern era, if one was born with bad vision, one walked into trees for the rest of their lives. There was nothing that could be done about it. It was just a curse of their being. Just one example of many that we can mention, which today we take for granted, which in ancient times was a want that would have been inconceivable. We couldn't even imagine a situation in which something as basic and inherent in our nature as bad vision could ever be remedied. Now, I could dwell on it at great length about the growth of the prosperity of the society in which we live, but the important issue is, what did it? What was the magic? What took place that caused this spark to occur just a couple of 100 years ago in certain parts of the world that has brought us to where we are today? And it's imperative that we identify what it is, because there are some things that we know that are wrong, and there are some things that we know that are right, and we better know the difference. Ben Rogie, who was a lecturer in the fee staff for many, many years, and professor at Wabash College, used to tell a story many years ago about a debate that he used to have with his next-door neighbor over the Martins and the Starlings. And this was always in the context of a lecture on competition, but the point was well made. And he and his neighbor were arguing one night about whether they were Martins or whether they were Starlings. And his neighbor insisted that they were Starlings and that we should kill them. And Rogie was just as insistent that they were Martins, which was, of course, a very benevolent bird, and that we should do everything to encourage them. And the argument went on and on, because there's a major decision here to be made. Do we feed them or do we kill them? And finally, after they'd argued for quite some time, Rogie said, I've got a confession to make. I really don't know the difference between a martin and a starling. And his neighbor laughed and he says, neither do I. And so Ben Rogie's point was, well, before you shoot, you better know the difference between a martin and a starling. And so it is true with ideas as well, that before we undertake a course of action that destroys our society, we'd better have some idea of what's right and what's wrong, what works and what doesn't work. And so what we're going to try and do here today, and all of these lectures may be topical in nature, but they're all directed towards one thing. And that is, we're going to try and convince those who need convincing that freedom works, plunder doesn't. In the long run, a society that chooses to plunder itself will destroy itself. That the only society that has any hope for the human race is a society that is based on the principles of private property and human freedom of choice, individual freedom of choice. And these are the basic prerequisites to explain why we are where we are today. The development of the market economy didn't just happen. Richard Weaver's old book, Ideas Have Consequences. How true. After watching Gandhi, I really appreciate how ideas have consequences. Ideas can be very powerful. They can even get the ex-president of the United States to pound nails in the Lower East Side on Labor Day. Ideas are powerful. Bad ideas or good ideas, whatever the case, they do influence everything that we do. And so it's imperative that we have the right ideas, that we preserve the right ideas, that we know that what we're doing is right, and that we're not contributing to the further demise of the human race. If there's anything that we can get across here that's, today, it is the notion that you will not find the answers through the political process, that will be able to distinguish the enemy, the problem, from the solution. Keep referring to old friends. Another one that is a very, very close personal friend of mine that's been on the fee staff for many, many years, and he's back again, Dean Russell. He and I used to teach together many years ago back in Michigan, and Dean used to say to me, Anderson, the problem with most people is that they can't identify the problem. How in God's world can you ever expect them to come up with a proper solution when they don't even know, number one, maybe that there is a problem, but if they know that there is a problem, they don't know what it is. Which leads me to one of my favorite chauvinist stories. Ladies, forgive me. Of the gal who had just graduated from Vassar College. Now, Vassar College is a little ex-girls' school north of me on the Hudson River in Poughkeepsie, New York. She'd never been west of the Hudson River in her life. Matter of fact, she wasn't even sure there was anything west of the Hudson River. So naturally, she got a job with the government because she was going to do good. She was going to solve problems. So she got a job with the government to be an agricultural expert on the problems of the farmers and ranchers of the Pacific Northwest. And off she went into the west to the Potomac River, to Washington, D.C. And after a couple of years, the bureaucrat boss said, you know, I think it's time as a government expert on agricultural problems in the Pacific Northwest that you go out and make sure that it's there. And so she heads for the Pacific Northwest, and she's holding forth this group of ranchers and farmers. And she says, now, gentlemen, I understand you're having a problem with the coyotes and your sheep. Now, she said, the way you solve that problem is to neuter the coyotes. And there's this long pause in the audience. Finally, an old rancher in the back row puts up his hand. He says, lady, what do you mean, neuter the coyotes? And utterly disgusted with his ignorance, she says, well, I mean for you to castrate them. And the farmer says, lady, I don't believe you quite understand our problem. Them coyotes ain't having sex with our sheep, they're killing them. Well, it's important to know the problem if you're going to find a solution. And if you look into our society today and you see the mess, and you listen to the political rhetoric that we're going to be forced to listen to in the next couple of months, you're going to discover something. They don't even know what the problem is. How could they possibly have a solution? It's going to be an interesting couple of months, isn't it, to see if a major party political candidate for the President of the United States can get elected on a platform of attacking his opponent because he's in favor of religion and in favor of lower taxes. Can a person in our society today get elected by attacking religion and advocating higher taxes? It's going to be an interesting period in our political economic history. I don't think there's much chance of it. But nevertheless, we do hear madness. And most of it comes, of course, out of the political camps, both sides. And we're going to hear lots of it in the weeks ahead. And so it's important to be able to glean through all of the mess in order to know what's right and what's wrong. And the first thing we got to learn is that no civilization, no society is going to go anywhere if it truly believes that they can live on the backs of somebody else. If something in this society becomes more sacred than apple pie and motherhood, the idea that somebody else should pay for the services rendered to us, we've had it. If the idea in our society is that through surrendering our freedom to the political process, we can achieve a higher level of security and well-being for everyone, we've had it. If we lose the idea of individual freedom of choice as a way of life in this society, we've had it. And so, let me take a look this morning with these opening remarks at what did happen in our society in the last 150 years that's brought us to where we are. Because, as I said in the beginning, it's not always been so. It's not always been this way. In the last 150 years, some remarkable changes took place in the economic, political, sociological, yes, moral and ethical structure of our society. What happened was we saw in Europe a breakdown of the old feudal system. The idea of the few plundering the many. The aristocracy living off the backs of the serf. European feudalism was beginning to disintegrate. Indeed, efforts were made to bring it to this country. Spanish conquests, to a great extent, were very successful in bringing feudal values into the New World. Fortunately, the Norte Americanos were a little luckier. The Scots came first. The folks that came into this country were not the aristocrats, but they were the serfs. The folks that came in were the outcasts, the misfits, the victims, the people that were running away from tyranny. And so maybe it was just a historical accident. I don't know. I sometimes think that it was. That a group of misfits, outcasts, victims should land on the shores of a sparsely populated country. Basically at that time inhabited by primitive Stone Age people, contrary to the mythology that we're having imposed upon us today about how the American Indians, you see, were this great civilization that owned everything. They didn't even have the concept of individuality or ownership in their vocabularies. They were primitive Stone Age people living a life of unbelievable misery, as of course were our early ancestors. But they came into this country, or this land I should say, as misfits, outcasts, unruly. There was only one way to survive, and that was to cut it for yourself, because if you didn't, you died. And so I think probably when you look at colonial history, what you will observe is that the development of rugged individualism was not a philosophical development as much as it was a pragmatic thing, a necessity for survival. There were no alternatives. There was nothing but hardship. And so the early development of this country, with a very sparse population relative to land, was an interesting one in human history. We were coming into a world, or into a land area, where basically land was uneconomic. Developed land, of course, was quite valuable. But land itself was basically a free good. All one had to do was go over the hill and it was there for the taking, for the clearing. And I've often felt that this sparse population relative to land contributed to a great extent to the development of what we called rugged individualism in America. If things got too bad in the colonies of Virginia and North Carolina or Massachusetts or Rhode Island, they just moved west. Took on a few primitive Indians. Those that survived had a place to live. As things got bad, people voted with their feet and were able, basically, for the first 150 years of the populating of this land, able to move west into virgin territory. Land, essentially, moving west, was a free good. Whatever the reason, we did develop a society in which the idea of individual initiative and self-responsibility became a way of life. Now, in that developing period, what we observed was that what we did with our lives was our own. As we created primitive property, it was our own. We possessed it. When folks did finally meet up, they met up primarily for the purposes of trading, exchanging. If you look at the history of the colonial history particularly, not the history of the Republic, but the colonial history of America, you see this trading process going on wherever people met. Why? Because as free individuals possessing the rights to their property, they had something with which to exchange. The concept of private property rights, individual ownership of property, was being formulated, of course, in the 18th and 19th century by the great liberal philosophers of the time. John Locke down through, of course, all of the early founding fathers, which came later. But the idea of doing this was being practiced in America. And so it was perfectly natural that when Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations attacked mercantilism and advocated the idea of free trade, that the people of America accepted it as a natural course of their development. It's the way it had always been. Trading individually among members of a society is a very ancient thing. Again, referring back to your article on the role of women in economic history, which is, by the way, if you don't read anything else in the Freeman that we have with us today, be sure and read this article, because it is a very profound statement. But referring back to that, in this trading process, in this productive process that we had, there did develop, wherever surplus property existed, the temptation for some people to plunder it. But in America, in colonial America, the somebodies to plunder it were very few in number, and they were not able to mass the force of plunder on the citizens of this early country because they were so thinly spread throughout all of North America. It was not as simple a process as it was in England or France or Germany, wherever you had a denser population relative to land. And so the early idea of plundering, which had dominated human history throughout the millennium, was not as feasible in this country. And then we tied with it a philosophy which was so important to the development of the market economy, the philosophy of individual freedom of choice, that it was a matter of right that people would possess their property and direct their own lives as long as it was peaceful. And in this country, we were very receptive to the idea, to that revolutionary idea, that government, rather than being an agency of plunder, should instead be an agency of justice. That the function of government in our society should be to protect the lives of individuals and to protect and safeguard their property. It was a very unique, revolutionary idea. That agency of force which had throughout the millennium plundered the human race, government, whatever form you want to have it, should now be used as a means of achieving the peace, achieving justice, protecting lives and property. This was the revolutionary idea of America. This unique, discrete function of government keeping the peace. That was the remarkable force that first brought into being the modern era known as the market economy. For once we structured a society based on a legal framework to keep the peace, to achieve justice through the protection of life and property, individuals were freed to engage in productive activity. Furthermore, the results of their productive activity would not be plundered away from them, either by other individuals or by the safeguarding institution known as government. And so we had, of course, the birth of the modern American Republic. The idea of a government, a self-governing institution, subordinate to the individuals within this society, structured to serve all of us by keeping the peace. Now, we today call that government limited government. This is to us the ideal concept of government. It is an agency within society, outside the marketplace, outside the productive activities of individuals, charged with the responsibility of redressing wrongs to life and property. We see government basically as that blindfolded goddess of justice with the balance scales. It's in our little bullet on the issue of every Freeman magazine. The equal scales of justice. The blindfolded goddess of justice, keeping the peace. But of course what we know is that this limited concept of government, this ideal concept of government to keep the peace, does not exist today. Today we're back with the ancient way. The blindfolded goddess of justice today is peaking. Tell me who you are, and I will tell you whether you shall be a victim or a beneficiary of my plundering process. The law today does not address justice. The law today does not protect lives and property. The law today plunders property and directs our lives by ripping off some of us for the benefit of others. We have transformed that limited concept of government back into the monster it always was, an agency of human plunder. But for a long time, this country did enjoy a limited concept of government. And throughout the 19th century, as a result of an institution safeguarding lives and protecting property, not perfectly, of course, but nevertheless charged with that duty, throughout the 19th century, under such conditions, such legal structure existing in our society, individuals were freed up to engage in productive, peaceful activities, serving themselves and their fellow man. And so what happened is that for the first time in human history, individuals could concentrate on being productive rather than protecting themselves from plunder or participating in a plundering process.
And this process of productive, creative individuals acting out their self-interest led to the great miracle known as the market economy. For what happened is that we learned very early on that we as individuals can serve our own selves best by participating with others in social cooperation. That we can better ourselves not by going off into some autistic isolation booth, but we can better ourselves by participating with others in trading, in producing, in consuming the material resources that we create. What we learned, of course, that is that for each of us, it's better to engage in specialization, in productive activity, to produce not directly for ourselves, but to produce for others in the market, and to exchange then that which we produce for the things that we wish to consume through voluntary exchange. This trading process enhances the economic well-being of everyone. Now, this again was not something that was unique and new to the modern era. This is not something that we learned in the 16th or 17th or 18th centuries. This is something that had always been so. People had always probably been, to some extent, specialists in productive activity. They had always probably been, to some extent, engaging in trade. What I've got, you want. What you've got, I want. Let's engage in a voluntary exchange. I'm sure that's very ancient. But what happened in the modern era, the thing that literally was the catalyst in an economic sense, the thing that brought us to where we are today, was the formulation of indirect exchange. Now, let me be more specific as to what I mean by indirect exchange. We discovered that if specialization was beneficial, if exchanging resources was beneficial, anything that could contribute to or enhance even further that process of specialization and exchange would be beneficial and desirable. And what we discovered, folks, was and I don't want to call it magic, but what we discovered was that profound dynamic force that brought us into the modern era. We discovered how to engage in economic calculation through the use of a medium of exchange called money. Now, money, it was simply the most marketable of all economic goods that were being traded in the society of the time. But what we discovered is that if instead of trading apples for oranges or milk for cider, if instead we could exchange the things that we produced for another economic medium called money, and then use the money to acquire the other things that we wanted, we could bring into being, and folks, there is no way we can overemphasize the importance of this, we can bring into being a price system. We can bring into being a common economic denominator. That is, we are, through the marketplace, the use of money, we are able to have a means by which we can compare everything to a single economic good. Everything suddenly takes on a price. Now, there's an important role that evolves from this. When we structure a society based on prices rather than direct barter, we can engage in a much more sophisticated economic calculation of the worth in the marketplace now of this to that. We can compare apples to oranges and milk to cider, all through a common denominator economic good called money. And that's the way the world works today. Think about it. The market is our guide, right? We turn to the marketplace, and the market directs what we do as producers and consumers. By what? Price. Why do I drive a K car instead of a Rolls Royce? I assure you it has something to do with price. Why do I engage in this kind of economic activity rather than that kind of economic activity? It has something to do with price. Everything that we do. When we go shopping, what do we mean? We go shopping and we have a good time based on price. I never mind taking my wife to Bloomingdale's or Saks Fifth Avenue to go shopping. My wife is about as Scotch as anybody I've ever known. I have nothing to fear She's a CPA. Her mind is a human calculator. I absolutely know for certain I don't even need to carry my wallet with me when I go to Saks Fifth Avenue. We can shop all day. No threat to my economic well-being or hers. But God forbid when we go to the Stormville flea market. This, I know, is going to be an expensive day when we go underground and we enter the real world with all of the people offering their wares. I better have lots of money with me, because you'd be amazed how easily it is to go bankrupt saving hundreds of dollars at a flea market. Everything looks tempting. The worst thing I've ever done in my life was I took my wife to Bloomingdale's the day before we went to the flea market. It's always more fun, you know, to do it the day after. Price determines everything that we do. But folks, here is the key. Here is the key to the development of the market economy. When economic resources are priced in monetary expression, when a price system evolves, for the first time we are no longer required to produce goods of direct consumption. Now, let me explain this if I can. Until money evolved, everything that we as individual producers did had to result in the production and in the creation of a good that had immediate utility or use value to the consumer. I had to produce something that you could see as immediate use value to you as a consumer. It had to be a consumer good. Now, if you want to have some fun, just imagine how many things you could produce that we have today that have immediate use value to the consumer. You might grow a few apples and maybe even some oranges in Southern California or Arizona, maybe even in Texas, possibly Florida. But think how few of the things that we have at our disposal today that you can produce. I'll go this far. There isn't anything in this room that any one of us, or I'll go even so far as to say all of us combined, could produce. There isn't a single manufactured item in this room that all of us combined could duplicate. That was the limiting factor on the human race from the dawn of our existence unto the development of money. The most that we could produce in the way of goods were the things that we as one finite individual had the capacity to duplicate, or maybe just a few of us together could duplicate. Now, I don't want to do a put down of all of the great things that were produced in the ancient world, but they were still basically very primitive things. It was only when we had the development of a price system, a money economy, that we could come into creating what I call the compartmentalization of the production process. Because now everything was expressed in money, it was no longer necessary for the individual to produce a good of consumption. All he had to do was produce a component, a small component, that would be used at a price in the production of another component. And finally, a third and fourth component. Now, this didn't happen overnight. This was not a revolution. This was an evolutionary process. But the role of money in making it possible to rationally calculate the value of the screws and bolts and the other items that are needed from over here to bring them together to produce finally a good that we could consume cannot be overstated. For it was this force that brought into being the modern economy. And today, when we look around, what we see, of course, is a society in which very, very few people produce anything of immediate use value, but instead are engaged in some aspect, some very narrow aspect, compartmentalized aspect of a very broad, roundabout production process. The Seiko watch, the quartz watch, which has virtually eliminated the Swiss watchmaker, would have been inconceivable without a price system. Even as Leonard Read told us many years ago, something as simple as the lead pencil would have been inconceivable without the price system. The compartmentalizing of production, which was achievable only because of the existence of money in our society, which gave us a price system, made the compartmentalization of production possible. We can't know everything. We know some things. Some things are right and some things are wrong. But because we are finite in both physical and intellectual abilities does not mean that we are incapable of coordinating these finite abilities through a market process for the benevolence of all of us. It's an unbelievable force that's at work here. This coordinating power of money. Now you know and I know that a great amount of attention is devoted to the subject of money. Maybe because people think, that it's just wealth, that it's just something we want more of. We can look at it in a very narrow aspect and see it that way. That money is important because it's a sign of means by which we can calculate our wealth. We want more of it, of course we do. But the real value of money in any society has been not what it did for the individual in terms of giving him more wealth, but what it does in terms of coordinating the finite abilities of the millions of participants in the marketplace so that we can produce and create economic resources that would have been inconceivable in our earlier economic history. This is the uniqueness of money. We can coordinate the finite, limited abilities of all of us so that we can bring together the unique talents of this individual with the unique talents of that individual in such a way that we can bring into being the Seiko quartz watch or the simple lead pencil. We can bring into existence an economy such as we live in here and now, where there isn't a thing in this room of a manufactured nature that all of us combined could even begin to duplicate. Coming down here yesterday for the first time, I flew on one of these new Boeing 767s. It's a wide-bodied, intermediate range jet passenger plane. Been getting a lot of attention because of its fuel efficiency. But as we were flying in it and took off, I said to Howie Bacher, who was sitting next to me, I said, "Isn't this just unbelievable? This thing is leaving the ground with just 2 engines. The tremendous advancement in metallurgy alone that makes that miracle possible. How many hundreds of thousands of parts do you suppose are in that one airplane, that one aircraft? What brought it together so that it's flyable? Thank God it is. The market process brought it together. The role of money is a coordinating force in our society, is its most important role. Its sole function, folks, is to serve as a medium of exchange. Everything else is auxiliary to that. The function of money is to serve as a viable medium of exchange so that we can efficiently and effectively coordinate the activities of millions of participants in a rational and economically benevolent way. That's why money is so important. When you start messing with money, when you start manipulating your medium of exchange, you're short-circuiting the coordinating process. You're breaking down the efficiency of productive individuals to bring together their unique talents for the benefit of everyone within our society. The destruction of money does not inflict nearly as great an evil on the individual as it does on the whole of our society as the market process succumbs. Back in the 70s, I used to spend a lot of time talking about inflation, the destruction of money through political manipulation. And my point was that, indeed, of course, everyone is concerned about how do I save myself? As the currency system is destroying, how do I preserve my own wealth? What can I do to save myself? To which I would respond and really cheer them up, you can't. Because the destruction of money does not destroy your wealth. The destruction of money destroys your very society in which you live. It's kind of like trying to save yourself in an age of currency destruction, trying to get a first-class ticket on the Titanic. It really doesn't matter too much. If you're sinking, you're going to go down, whether it's first or last. And the destruction of currency destroys the market process, the coordinating power of the market process to bring into being the millions of economic goods and services that we take for granted. And so money's important. Not because we're some sort of a Silas Marner greedy, wanting more for ourselves, putting our gold shekels in the ground. That's not what money is all about. What it's all about is economic freedom, economic well-being. And so, we look around us today and we see that it's coming unglued. That this modern miracle called the market economy, which was brought into being by a structure of economic freedom, of private property rights, and a limited government safeguarding both, is coming apart. That the economic medium, money, which evolved out of the market process, has virtually been destroyed and turned over in total to the political institution of government. Money today being nothing but a piece of paper issued by government, monopolized by government, politically manipulated in whatever way the authorities wish. It's a sure sign that our social order is in a state of decline. When we look at the activities of government today and when we listen to the political rhetoric of government today, what do we hear? A plea for more efficient protection of life and property by the government? A more effective protector government? Let me come back to it, which I said earlier. Government's not in the business of protecting life and property. Government's in the business of plundering property and directing our lives. We don't turn to government today to pass laws to protect us. We turn to government to pass laws to provide for us. The great political debates in our society today are over how government should more efficiently provide for us by taking our freedoms and our property away from us. It is almost madness that in this massive age of political plunder, a major political party can be arguing for the taking of even more, to balance the budget of this monster. Isn't it mad that something that is destroying our society as systematically as the plundering state should be making the plea for fiscal sanity by plundering us even more? And that's where we are today. We are in a society where today government is taking over 50% of the personal disposable income of the American people, and my God, they want to take even more. We're in a society today where government is involved in practically every activity of our being, and they want to get involved even more. When are you a slave? I don't know. I think you're a slave when you no longer know you're a slave. We live in a society today where people aren't outraged anymore over having their lives directed by the political process. They have sanctioned the process totally. I come from one of those more enlightened states, New York, where we take great pride in leading the way towards your serfdom. Just a month or so ago, in my state, the state legislature, in its infinite wisdom, passed a law mandating the wearing of seatbelts. No reaction. All we read were all those true statistics, no question about it, that people who wear seatbelts are less likely to die in an automobile crash than people that don't. You notice I said in an automobile crash. If you're not wearing the seatbelt, you got a chance of getting thrown out of the crash and living. There's no question, however, that it's true. As a pilot myself, I fully appreciate the importance of wearing seatbelts. I'm not opposing the idea. But what I am saying is this: there was no reaction to the loss of freedom of choice. And folks, if you lose the freedom of choice to do dumb things, you no longer live in a free society. Because if you can't do dumb things, you'll never learn to do right things. That when freedom of choice is taken away from you by the state, as it is systematically being taken away from us today at the local and state and federal levels, and we react in no way whatsoever, but just ho-hum and accept it as a part of our culture, I think maybe we already are enslaved and don't know it. Now, rather than offer cyanide capsules at the conclusion of this lecture and tell you that there is no hope, let me say this: that thank God those things that we believe to be true that are not, and that are harmful, have harmful effects. There isn't anything more scary to me than the thought of having gone through the madness of a return to statism, to totalitarianism, to massive plunder, and not having bad consequences. There is nothing that would have been, to me, a more horrifying nightmare than to have gone through all of this and not had ill effects. But we are having ill effects. Our society is disintegrating. We are seeing a moral or ethical breakdown of values within our society that are harmful. And that's wonderful. As long as bad ideas have bad consequences, there is hope for all of us, isn't there? And the beauty of it is this: freedom works. The idea of the individual having freedom of choice and being sovereign over his own life leads to peace and harmony. It leads to the better life. Now, it's not because I have said so, it's because we have seen it happen. We have experienced the result. This nation, under freedom, within a framework of private property structure as hampered as it has been, has achieved an unprecedented level of material prosperity, peace, and harmony. It is absolutely inconceivable to me that bad ideas will rule the world for the millennium ahead. To me, at least, while we may go through some adversity, we will pay the price immediately for such bad ideas, and in paying the price, we will achieve the better life ahead. For you see, Leonard Read used to have it put it this way, that throughout all of history there was a wave effect, periods of what he used to call evolution and devolution. And he said it was as an absolute necessity that we have this wave effect if we are to achieve a higher level tomorrow. And the way I always like to put it, which was saying virtually the same thing, is that as things get worse, things get better. Because all of us learn the hard way, not just me. All of us learn through the wrongful course of action what is the rightful course of action. We have learned that freedom works and that it's right. We've learned that the private property order can achieve for us a market process wherein material prosperity and abundance for the millions is assured. It is inconceivable to me that rational human beings would abandon what's right for what's wrong for the millennium ahead. And so as we go through a period in the 20th century which will be known without question as the age of statism, as a regressing period where we for a short moment in our human history tried to go back to the old way, I am just as sure that the age ahead will be one of freedom, peace, and harmony and prosperity for all of us. But ideas do have consequences. And it is important to understand that what we know may be right or may be wrong. And there is nothing that we need to know that is more right than the idea that individuals should be free. Thank you.
Now, we're supposed to take a short coffee break, and if Ed Opitz didn't make the wrong turn, he's probably standing right outside the door, and he is to start at about 10:15. But we've got maybe 2 or 3 minutes here, which is great, for you folks to have a shot at me. We're probably going to be going most of the hour with lecture, but we will have these 2 hours, both this morning and this afternoon, for discussion with the entire group. However, we do have just a couple minutes here, so if there's somebody with a burning comment or question, have at me. Yes, sir.
Mr. Anderson, I certainly enjoyed your speech. But you're speaking to the wrong group. I understand the Democrats are having a meeting over here today.
Well,
You're in the wrong.
No, I'm not. No, really, we're in the right room. This is something, too, that we've got to understand. Boy, as a college professor of 13 years, take my word for it, it's true. Don't waste your energy and your time for a moment. You don't have that much of it on people who are not receptive and interested in what you have to say. It's a complete waste of time.
concentrate your energies on yourself and a better understanding of what this philosophy is all about, and on those of like thinking. Your time then is well spent. It's called maximizing utility. I know there's this all in all of us. There's this desire, to want to reform the next guy and straighten him out, but you can't. You see, can you think of anything that would be a greater waste than for a communist to try and convert me to Marxism? Okay? Now he could work from dawn till dusk, day after day. I'd get terribly bored, I'm sure, and angry. But what a waste of his time. Now, I'm not in the wrong room, and neither are you. What is necessary for any remnant is to be sure that we are all insane together in our love of liberty. There is a need, and this is basically what the Foundation has provided over the last 40 years, or close to 38 years. And that is, it's been the sort of the mecca to those who love liberty and the private property order, the freedom philosophy. We need the reassurance from those of like thinking that our position is not as radical and as insane as those people in the other room might have us believe. They are the barbarians that are still in our midst. It's a very old idea, the idea of some people plundering other people through the use of their property. There is nothing new in the democratic platform. It was in Caesar's, and it was in Pharaoh's, and it's been in the platform of every aristocratic monarch throughout the Middle Ages. It's just in a different form. It's a tragic thing, but it's part of our human psyche to want to have power over our fellow citizen. And Karl Marx wasn't completely crazy. He just didn't have it right. He talked about the class struggle. He was very holistic, as all the classical economists were. Very holistic. He talked about the history of the human race was a history of class struggle. Well, wrong. But it has been a history of some individuals struggling to get out from underneath the oppression of other individuals. He just never got it down to where it should have been.